Hello. Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Just about 1 minute early, so we'll give people time to get seated. So I'm really delighted to be back speaking about China again at a third time. And actually, there's going to be a bonus talk tomorrow because we have these unexpected hours at sea. But I will not be talking about China tomorrow. I'll be talking about my books. And yesterday I had a few of these, and several people wanted them, which is a card that has my signature and also my website, so information about my book. So afterwards, if you want, I have some of these, but I'll be talking more about that tomorrow. So welcome to the third and final one in my series of Understanding China Better. And as many of you know, I'm Dori Jones Yang, and I'm the author of this book, When the Red Gates Opened, a memoir of China's reawakening, which is about my personal experience as a reporter in China in the 80s. So let's jump into today's topic, which is actually my favorite talk, and I hope that you like it as well. That will China be the next superpower? And it really, we're going to be looking today at China's worldview, values, and ambitions. So what does that mean? I'll let you know. So I always like to start with a story. This one's about my husband, Paul Yang, who's that little baby in the picture. He looks a little different now. He was born in China in 1938, which was a bad year in China. The Japanese invaded in 1937, and they had been marching across the country, brutally taking city after city. And his father was a military officer in the Chinese National Army, and he had just barely survived the Battle of Shanghai. He even had a bullet hole in his hat. And he was being transferred to a safer city, a little bit inland, with his wife, and they were taking a train to the city where he was assigned, and his wife was pregnant with Paul, and she went into labor just before they got to the station. So this is wartime China, and they get off into the city they've never been to before. As you can imagine, his father's panicked, running around, looking for a doctor, a hospital, anything, a safe place for his wife to give birth. And he found a small hospital, and that's where he was born. So that was kind of his first wartime experience, is really his own birth. And so from his childhood, he remembers the Japanese bombers strafing the city where he lived, in the city of Xi'an later. And his family, in the middle of the night, would wake up the kids and have to run to a bomb shelter. And the Japanese army occupied, a lot of Americans anyway, don't realize that the Japanese occupied China for 8 years. So we think of World War II as being 4 or 5 years long. Well, for them it was 8 long years of occupation by a foreign power. And then, after a few years after the war ended, the Civil War began in China, started up again between the Chinese communists and the government. And so when Paul was 10, the communists were getting closer, and his family had to flee to the south, and his education was very much disrupted. And then a year later, when he was 11, they had gotten as far as Shanghai, and the communist army had gotten there too, and it was time to leave. And his father managed to get 4 airplane tickets from Shanghai to Taiwan. And he had a little sister there, so it was a family of 4. But the problem was the tickets were on 2 separate flights. So try to imagine this. They could hear the gunfire in the distance, and they had to decide. Sophie's choice, right? They had to decide who was going on the first plane and who would go on the second plane. And of the 4 of them, the one most in danger was his father, who would have been executed, probably. So his father got on the first flight with his little sister. And Paul is sitting there, age 11, with his mother at the airport, in the Shanghai airport, hoping that the second plane will take off, but it wasn't sure. The idea was that Paul would take care of his mother if the second plane didn't go off. So they were listening for the gunfire and hoping the second flight would go, and fortunately it did. That's why he's here. And it landed safely in Taiwan, and the communists did take the Shanghai airport that night, and that was, in fact, the last flight out of Shanghai. So this is the kind of dramatic story of his childhood. But he was only one of several million Chinese people who had to flee their homeland, and some went to Taiwan, some went to Hong Kong, some went overseas, and they were forced to start life anew with basically almost no possessions. And then after that, Paul and his family lived in peace in Taiwan, and he went to high school and college there, and then he emigrated to the United States after he finished college, so life was very stable. And I realize, I don't know if there are any Europeans in the group, but that many Europeans have similar terrifying memories of wartime occupation. But I will say, as a US-born American, as I am, and maybe some of you are, I don't have those kinds of memories, because the last time any foreign armies invaded the US was, do you remember? 1814. And the last time we had a major war on our own soil was 1860s. So in the living memory of everyone alive today, Americans just have always thought that wars are things that take place in faraway countries. And so we have experienced instability, yes, of course, urban riots, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, but nothing in our national experience even compares to the mass fear and disruption that Paul and his whole generation of Chinese lived through. So let's jump forward in time. This is actually me in 1982 in Hong Kong. That's when I was sent to be a foreign correspondent in Hong Kong. And just 3 months after I got there, in September of 1982, I embarked on a reporting trip, my first major reporting trip in China, 5 major cities ending in Beijing. And I was at age 28, I was kind of just getting my feet wet, trying to figure out how on earth to cover all of China, which had actually been closed, and we didn't know what had been going on there for so many years. So while I was in Beijing, by coincidence, this lady arrived the very same time that I was there. So British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher made her first ever trip to China to talk with China's top leader, Deng Xiaoping, about the future of Hong Kong. And Hong Kong's real estate and stock market went nuts, which as a business reporter, that was a really big story for me. I jumped into action. It was a very dramatic story. But later, I thought a lot about some of the things that were said at that time. And one thing really stuck with me. China's top leader, Deng, promised Hong Kong stability and prosperity. And those words really stuck with me, and it frankly puzzled me a little bit. And over the 40 years since then, I've realized that these words are more than just a promise to Hong Kong. They're actually core Chinese values. Prosperity, of course, is easy to understand. We all want our countries to be prosperous. But stability, it really isn't a core value for most of us because we're used to it. But Chinese don't take it for granted. So if asked, I think most Americans, if you said, what are your core values of your country? And I think most of them among the top would be freedom and democracy. And I wager that's probably true for many other countries as well, certainly the Western countries. But when we Westerners look at China today, very often what we see is what we think of as the opposite of that. One-man rule, oppression, and human rights abuses, right? And so to some, it may seem that China has no values at all. But China does have values, and that's what I want to talk about today. They're distinctly different from our values in the West. And they're based not so much on communism, but on China's history, which differs greatly from ours, as you know. So it's my hope today that if we can better understand Chinese values and perspectives, that we can develop a more productive and pragmatic approach to China based on mutual respect. So my goal is, once again, to give you an even-handed view on how current affairs look from both China and from the West, just to kind of broaden your perspective on what you know about, particularly when you hear China's leaders speak and act in ways that seem confusing. This gives you a little context for that. So are you with me? Let's go. So first, let's get back to stability. Why is stability so important to the Chinese? So as I mentioned, China's recent history has been very different from that of the US. So in the lifetimes of many people alive today, including my husband, China suffered through many, many years of terrible wars. And the World War II lasted from 1937 to 45, and then fighting resumed again with the Civil War, so it was really all the way till 1949. That was a very long period of time. There were massacres, starvation, displacement, and tens of millions of refugees having to flee from their ancestral homes. And those years were particularly awful. But the years before that, the 20 or so years before that, China also suffered from many, many years of instability. So in 1911 was when the last emperor of China was overthrown. And actually, there were people who tried to set up a representative democratic government, but it didn't work, and the country fell into chaos. And so for decades, China was this patchwork. Each of those pink areas is where one warlord controlled a big amount of territory. So these various warlords who were appointed by nobody were fighting with each other over territory. And it was, for the people, of course, it was a really rough time. And then when Chiang Kai-shek took power as Generalissimo, he tried to restore order and reunify the country, but that involved more fighting, province after province after province. So the fighting just kept going on. And the communists arose during this time, and sometimes they were fighting, sometimes they were fleeing. It was a chaotic, turbulent time. So after all of that, Deng's promise of stability and prosperity resonated with all Chinese, but it resonated with the people of Hong Kong that he was speaking to at that time. Many of the people of Hong Kong were themselves refugees or descendants of refugees from China's turbulent 20th century. And while the communists themselves had contributed to that turmoil, by the 1980s, under Deng, things had changed. And since the 1980s, China has not fought a single war. And China's leaders today say that their top goal is common prosperity. And you can only have that when the country is at peace and the government is stable. So that gets to a second value that I wanted to highlight today, which is, because of all this experience, Chinese value a strong central government. And I'm not sure how this resonates with people from other countries, but many Americans distrust the whole idea of a strong central government. We were founded as a republic, of course, with power shared by the cities and the states. And there's, among some people, there's a certain suspicion of government overreach. And some Americans prefer limited government with strong checks and balances. But most Chinese don't understand that whole idea at all, because many of them, and I'd venture to say, most Chinese citizens prefer a strong central government. So why is that? So China has had thousands of years of history with multiple dynasties, but one pattern I see is very clearly is that during periods of strong government, ordinary people thrived. And that's because during years of plenty, a strong government would build up stores of grain, and then when there were bad harvests, drought or storm, then the government would open the storehouses and feed the people. And so the government was a strong government was organized and able to take care of the people. And in periods of weak government, the Chinese people saw the opposite, which was war, bandits, starvation. So, of course, it's not enough for a government to just be, for a ruler just to be strong. The Chinese ideal is a ruler who is both strong and wise. I was looking for many different pictures of emperors over the years that have been famous in Chinese history as being strong and wise, and this is one of them. So what they would really like, and the best times in Chinese history have been when the emperor was able to take care of his people and bring about peace and stability, peace and prosperity for all. And now, of course, the communists have not always shown wise government, and in the 50s and 60s, they made some really terrible mistakes. But in the last 30 years, since Deng, China's government has maintained peace and stability and pursued common prosperity, giving opportunities to millions of people to rise out of poverty, as I was talking about yesterday. And this has really brought a good life to many people in China. So when Chinese people look at democracies around the world, they don't see a lot of stability. So it's not as appealing to them. In Chinese experience, people live better when the central government is strong and wise. So that's a very different angle of vision than we're used to. And third, consistent with these values, the Chinese, I'm sure you've heard this, value harmony. So when it comes to a choice between social harmony and individual human rights, they tend to prefer harmony. And some say this comes from their agricultural past, when villagers had to work together to bring in the harvest, and they were independent and therefore communal, and no farmer could make it on his own. But also, harmony has been central to the teachings of Confucius, whose systems of personal ethics shaped China for 2,500 years. So, as you probably know, Confucius taught a very strictly hierarchical and patriarchal system of personal values. Children obey their parents, wives obey their husbands, younger brothers obey the older brothers, citizens obey their rulers, and at the top of the pyramid was the emperor, the one ruler that everyone was expected to obey. And to us, that sounds like a lot of obeying, right? But the flip side was that the rulers were also expected to take, and the rulers and the fathers and the elder brothers and the husbands were expected to take good care of the people who were underneath their care. So today, of course, many Chinese reject many aspects of Confucianism. It's not universally accepted, all of these ideas. But there's no question that some of these values have continued to influence the social values to this day. And many prefer a government that is patriarchal. In other words, a government that takes care of them. So they look to their government with different eyes than we do. We don't necessarily expect our government to take care of us. Certainly not in the way the Chinese do. But by contrast, in the West, we value, as you know, individualism, and therefore also individual human rights. And Americans in particular have embraced the whole lone cowboy ideal and that of the self-made man. You know, we're taught that you have to take care of yourself, right? And in foreign policy, this has meant that we in the West place a high value on defending human rights. So ever since the end of the Holocaust, the defense of human rights has been a central tenet of foreign policy for the US and for many countries in Europe. And today, the US also has special international powers to sanction individuals and freeze bank transfers of people in other countries. So in recent years, the US has used those powers to try to shame and blame, and punish foreign officials for behavior inside their countries that Washington sees as abuses of human rights. So the Chinese government sees it very differently. Among other governments, the Chinese government resent this as interference in their internal affairs. But they also have a different view of human rights. They talk about basic human rights, which includes the right to food and shelter and education and health care, and frankly, safety from bombardment. And they say that their government says they have sought to provide those rights to all. And to many Chinese, not just the government, it's important to put social stability above the personal freedoms of individuals. This explains a lot of the differences that we have with China. So, of course, that's not the way we see it in the West. And our values are very deeply held, as are theirs, and this can lead to irreconcilable differences. And it has. So, wait a minute. I was thinking about all these things with values, and I thought, if the Chinese are so into communal welfare rather than individualism, how come Chinese as individuals are so highly competitive? Have you ever thought of this? It kind of seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? I mean, it's obvious that despite decades of communism, they took to capitalism in a really big way. We saw that in Shanghai, right? So isn't capitalism all about individual ambition? So it doesn't seem to fit. So I would say this relates to what I call a fourth Chinese value that I want to discuss, which is pride. So first, just a quick word about pride. I don't know if anybody, if you would recognize this as my husband in younger years, but when he first came to the US for graduate school in 1962, China was poor and backward. And he just was almost embarrassed to say that he was from China. And today, now, China's very strong. He feels a very, very clear and understandable sense of pride in the accomplishments of his fatherland. So overall, though, what Chinese pride often translates into is hard work, striving to be the best, and yes, hyper-competitiveness. And anyone who has ever witnessed Chinese tiger moms, have you seen anything about, have you read or seen among your friends tiger moms? This woman born in China but living in America, wrote a book about the Chinese tiger mom. Tiger moms pushing their kids to do better in school, right? And you'll recognize this whole tendency. So how do you explain this contradiction between group harmony and individual competitiveness? So I thought about this a lot. And I would say that it comes from this. For thousands of years, the way for Chinese men to get power and prestige, the best way, was to become a government official. They were the most highly regarded people in society. And the only way to do that, this is for thousands and thousands of years, is to study for imperial examinations. And there was a whole series of exams that was based on very specific texts. You had to read these things. Every educated man had to study these and master them before they could pass a test and go on to the next level. And only those who passed up to a certain degree could get a position at a certain level of government. And the only way to go on would be to pass the next level. So credentials mattered. Hierarchy was very strict. No matter how well connected a man was, he couldn't advance if he didn't pass the next level of exams. So as you can imagine, wealthy parents would hire private tutors for their sons, and they knew exactly what texts they had to study. But even poor villagers would pool their funds and hire a teacher for the local farmers' sons and give them an education. And some of them passed the test and got to be high officials. And if a family had just one who got to a particularly high level, it was a matter of great family pride. We've been to a couple of places where you see Chinese family memorials, and they're very proud to say, 3 generations ago we had someone who was at this level, and 5 generations ago we had someone at that level. It's a matter of pride for the whole family. So what I'm saying is that competitiveness was just baked into the system, and the system was and is a meritocracy. So what about today? It's a communist system, right? But very Chinese. So believe it or not, those are students studying for the national college entrance exam. Try to imagine taking the SAT under those kinds of circumstances. So today in China, there's one national exam for anyone who wants to enter any university. And then all students are given a ranking. So of course, every student strives to do really well, and if the student gets a high score, it reflects well on his whole family, or her whole family. And not doing well on the test, well, you can imagine what that does in the family. So the other thing that's very different about China is that government officials always start off at the local level. They have to have a job in the city or the county or township, and then the best of them work up maybe to the province, and then the very best can work their way up to the national level. So today, every high-level leader in Beijing, sometimes you've seen these pictures where they're all these high-level officials in Beijing all wearing the same clothes. It looks like they're all the same. But every single person in that room has gone through this, has experience at the local and provincial levels. And Chinese are really proud of this system. And they kind of look with disdain on political systems in other countries where inexperienced people can run for office. That just doesn't sit right with them. That's not the kind of system that they think is something that they would want. They think that the best rulers are those who have risen through the ranks, proving themselves in exams and also through experience. So that's just a different angle of vision that the Chinese have. This gets us to the current Chinese president, Xi Jinping, and the vision that he created for building a rejuvenated China. He wants China to regain its former status as the best. These are my words. And of course, Americans have always wanted our country to be the best. So in my view, this kind of is at the core of why US-China relations have deteriorated so badly in the last few years. So until recently, I don't know if you even know who that guy is next to Elon Musk, but he's the head of one of the Chinese electric car companies. So until recently, and this is most of the time when I was reporting there, China was kind of like the younger brother learning from the West and from Japan. And the West was like the older brother. So an American business person would be very happy to say, oh, here, let me show you how to set up a great factory, and I can help you be more efficient and really show you how a good factory works and how you can sell things in our market. But until the Chinese started doing it better than we did, and then we aren't liking that so much, right? So now, in some technologies, as we spoke about yesterday, China threatens to overtake the West. And amazingly, a lot of us didn't see that coming. So a few years ago, experts were predicting that the Chinese economy, in terms of overall GDP, would exceed that of the US, perhaps as early as 2030. The red line is China, of course. The red line is always China. And the blue line is the US. And it's a little hard to see there, but 2024, the blue line is still above the red line. So in terms of overall GDP, the gross domestic product, the Chinese economy is still bigger than the US economy is still bigger than the Chinese economy. But there have been various estimates and forecasts about when China might take it over because of the fast growth rate. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, their growth rate has slowed down, so it's not as clear when or if this will happen. But frankly, I've always thought this was a really unfortunate comparison, and an unfair one too, because China has 4 times as many people as the United States. So when the overall size of the economy gets to be the same as the US, that means on a per capita basis, they have 1/4 of what we have. So as individuals, they're still only 1/4 as wealthy as the US. So if they do achieve parity, if and when they do achieve parity, they will still be considered a middle income nation, not necessarily a developed nation. So in any way, I think it's all about bragging rights, don't you? So I think this is just my analogy here, but there's a little bit like 2 overachieving students in the same class. The US and China both want to be the best, right? And that's called competition. but it doesn't, in my view, have to lead to military confrontation. So finally, on the last value I wanted to talk about, Beijing values, I would say, coexistence and non-intervention. So keep those words in mind for just a minute. So when Beijing refused to condemn Putin for his invasion of Ukraine, many of us in the West were kind of shocked and disgusted. How could China claim to be neutral in the face of naked invasion of one country by another, right? And this led to speculation. Well, does China have plans to invade its neighbors? And of course, part of the reason for China's neutrality is geopolitics and self-interest. China has a long border with Russia, and it benefits from good relations with Russia as its biggest neighbor, especially as the US has grown more hostile. But at a deeper level, this approach of non-intervention stems, I believe, from China's unique history. So I'd like to go into that just a little bit. So for more than 2,000 years, so the first picture over here is from 200 BC, basically the first time that the Chinese government that China was unified under a central government. And the second one is from basically from around 1800, when China was at its largest under the Qing dynasty. But still, as you can see, most of what's China today was a central unified country. So China has seen itself, its own self-image, as one large continental country unified under one ruler. Now, of course, occasionally it fell apart. Frequently it fell apart. There were civil wars, there were peasant rebellions, there was revolutionary turmoil. But throughout history, China has always pulled itself together again. And for most of China's history, its neighbors were not rival powers equally strong. I think this is really important. Now, of course, it's true, as many of you know, that the Mongols and the Manchus both conquered China at different times, but they set up new dynasties in Beijing and kind of adopted the Chinese system. So it's a little bit different than two rivals fighting each other for power. They came into Beijing and kind of blended into the system. And China still, throughout the centuries, saw itself as the central power, the Middle Kingdom. And China's army, for the most part, was stationed up along the Great Wall, protecting the homeland from raids from nomads. So my point is, though, that until the arrival of the Europeans in the 1800s, China never saw itself as competing with equally powerful rivals. So as a former history major, actually I was a European history major, not an Asian history major, but I find it fascinating to compare this history and this mentality that China has with the history of Europe. So if you think about it, you had the Greek Empire and the Persians, you had the Romans, you had the Byzantine Empire and the Arab conquest, the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish. Europe's whole history has been that of rivalry of rising and falling of empires based in different places. And each one was fighting against its rivals for territory and power and prestige. And this contrasts sharply with China's history and China's experience. So they just have a different mentality that comes from that. And also, China never got into the whole game of colonization. So no emperor ever dreamed of traveling the world to conquer territory and set up colonies and having a big empire around the world. In fact, only in one dynasty did China develop a large navy. You may have heard of this guy. He was an admiral named Zheng He back in the 1400s. So he had a huge navy, and much larger than any in Europe, and that was almost 100 years before the age of exploration began. And the emperor paid for a whole flotilla of 300 vessels, some of them more than 5 times bigger. This is actually a Portuguese ship down here, by comparison on size. This is a drawing, but it's based on numbers that we have from the Chinese record and from the Portuguese record. So much bigger vessels, and they were able to carry tens of thousands of men. And Zheng He made 7 naval expeditions called treasure voyages, and he traveled all the way out throughout Southeast Asia and up to India and all the way up to the Persian Gulf and along to the coast of Africa. And he brought along, for trading purposes, China's luxuries such as gold and porcelain and silk. And then he took away as tributes, gifts in exchange, spices and ivory and precious stones. And even, this is one of my favorites, when he got to Africa, he took back an elephant and a giraffe. And apparently on a later voyage, he brought back a second giraffe, so that there might be a little bit future giraffes. But here's the key difference. So although Zheng He was a military officer, we call him an admiral, equivalent of an admiral in the Chinese Navy, he did not conquer any of those countries or set up colonies or leave behind forces to rule those countries. And as far as we know, his intention was exploring the world and finding out what countries were out there, what products they had, expanding seaborne trade. And then he sailed home with all his men. And during one voyage, he died. And after that, a new emperor happened to take over, because the old emperor died as well. And the new guy decided he didn't want a navy. So he dismantled the whole navy, burned it, sank it, said, we don't need that. And China never had a strong navy again until now. Now they have a fairly strong one that they've built up just in the last 10 or 15 years, 10 or 20 years. So China could have built an empire back then, but that just wasn't their goal. So once the age of exploration began, as we all know, European countries, this is a little bit complicated of a map, but I think it's fascinating. So Europe is in black, and all those bright colors are places that the European countries at one point occupied as colonies. And they vied with each other to have a bigger empire. There's not much left that's in gray that wasn't conquered by some European power or another during that time. And by 1900, the Europeans and Japan had conquered well over half the world. I would say it's far more than half the world, looking at this map anyway. So you may have heard, or maybe not, some of you have heard perhaps, of the famous Thucydides trap. And that's about the whole question of what happens when rising powers meet ruling powers. So when one power has been strong for a long time and then another one comes up. So Graham Allison is a Harvard professor who wrote this very influential book in 2017. And what he did was very interesting. He analyzed 16 different conflicts over many centuries of a situation where there was a ruling power and then a rising power came up. In most cases, it ended in war, but not all. I mean, the US and Soviet Union didn't end up in a war, but in most cases they did. And he concluded that the United States and China were destined for war and could avoid it only with really careful diplomacy, which is a good warning. But in my view, he overlooked one big point. So of those 16 cases that he looked at, there was only one non-Western country that he analyzed, and that was the Japanese Empire, which had learned Western-style warfare from the Germans. And all the rest of the examples that he gave were rivalries between European or Western powers who had come out of that whole tradition of rivalry that I was talking about before. So rather than Allison's book, I really recommend this book by Kevin Rudd. Are there any Australians in the audience? Kevin Rudd was a prime minister of Australia, and he, at a young age, learned to speak Chinese, and he met many Chinese leaders. He was stationed in China for a long time. He's made a lifelong study of China, unlike Graham Allison. So this is someone who really understands China at a very deep level, and he wrote this book kind of in response, I think, to that other book, and he calls it the avoidable war. And his assessment is very frank and unflinching, but I think it's much more hopeful. So if you only read one, I'd recommend this one. So China may prove to be no better than those European rivals. But I would argue that the Chinese just don't see the world in the same way that Western powers do. They want to rebuild their country. They want to be much admired as a power that China once was, kind of regain the respect that China had in the world. But projecting their power throughout the world, I would argue, isn't in their DNA. And there are a lot of people who disagree with me, but this is what I get from looking at the history of China. So maybe I'm wrong. Let's watch and see. So coming back to the big question, will China be the next superpower? And does it aspire to be the next superpower in a military way? The US currently has, and it's very hard to get these numbers, but well over 160,000 troops serving in the world outside the US, in other countries. And it has many military bases on foreign soil, as you know. So far, China has set up only one actual military base outside what it claims as its own territory, and that's in Djibouti to protect its oil tankers. So it has one, but the US has hundreds around the world. And it's true that Xi Jinping is rapidly building up China's army and navy, but so far it seems mainly focused on defense of the homeland, with their ships and their airplanes stationed off of China's coast. And getting back to what we were talking about in the beginning, 8 years of occupation by a foreign country in the lifetime of many of us today, some of us today anyway, they have been attacked from the ocean, and now that they're strong, they really feel like they need a strong defense. So as you can see, China's encouraging cruise ships to stop at Chinese ports. I wish we could stop at Xiamen, don't you? I was disappointed that we couldn't go there. And they're eager to attract more foreign tourists. And so that's good for all of us who love to sail the seas. So I'm encouraged by last fall's summit between the presidents of China and the US. One of the things President Biden said was his goal was to manage competition with China responsibly. I was very, very happy to hear that. And President Xi said, the world needs China and the US to work together for a better future. I would like to take them both at their word. And President Xi's top priority is to resume China's economic growth and ensure stability and prosperity for his people, which brings us full circle to that promise made by Deng for stability and prosperity. So I would say if that is China's top goal, stability and prosperity, based on its history and values, as I've talked about today, I think it's time to stop treating China as the enemy. And if we do, in my view, I think there's a better chance that we can continue to live together in peace. So, thank you. We have only about 2 minutes, and I'm actually going to be hosting a dinner tonight in the dining room. But if anybody wants to come up and get one of these before I rush off to dinner, I'd be happy to do that. And tomorrow I'll be talking about my books. So thanks very much, and thanks to Jeffrey and all the folks in the tech room, and to Russ Roberts as well.